Thanks for the kind introduction, Daniel. So we're short in time, so I'm not going to introduce you our guests. You already know who they are. They just gave keynotes like a couple of minutes ago. Today we're going to talk about how technology changes lives and work. We're just going to get right to it, I guess.
Perfect.
So David, you've previously talked about how to have a more polite and subtle technology so it dissolves more into the fabric of everyday life. You've founded an IoT company in 2002, and then in your book in 2014, you talk about how IoT will impact life and work itself.
Enchanted objects.
Enchanted objects. Can you please tell us about that?
French, objet enchanté.
Objet enchanté.
Yeah.
I lived in Montreal. Québécois.
Right. So the sort of fundamental idea around that book was that nearly every product company will hope to embed technology or sensing or computation in those products. And I think we're seeing it really everywhere. I showed doorbells and baby cams, and now there are sports, like almost every brand of sports equipment has some higher end version that it's trying to do sensing, trying to do coaching as a service, and it's changing business models. Like there's a toothbrush company that's becoming an insurance company, because rather than selling just brushes or bristles, they're selling insurance only to those people who have good brushing habits. So it's interesting, like it's changing business models because it's not only selling things or the consumables of the things, but also the change in risk profile of the thing. So it's intriguing to work with lots of, I mean, sure, you must as well work with product companies and try to think about like how could Rimowa connect their luggage. You know, like even products that you wouldn't imagine could be internet connected are trying to think about how can they differentiate, how can they change their business model, and how can they hire designers and technologists to come to the party with new materials in order to do that.
I think what you often find, though, is that somebody will go into that blindly. They think it's a magic bullet if they just put some sort of computational power into their product. I actually think Snap is kind of a good example. I love the Snap glasses. I really did when they came out. But I thought it was a strategic play in experimenting with the market. But when I learned that they had warehouses full of the things that were unsold, I was like, well, of course, it's V1. What are you doing? Like, design it once, and there's a design for a purpose to put it out there and experiment and get information back in the real world.
But you should manufacture as few as possible.
Right, yeah.
But weren't you guys expecting a much faster adoption, especially in IoT, given what has happened to the consumer electronics companies over the past couple of years, even in the stock market?
Yeah, I mean, IoT, I think, has gone slower. It's gone fast on the industrial side. I think it's gone slower on the consumer side than I expected. I think the reason for that is, the interfaces are still awkward. We still have apps that are usually required in order to interact with our world. And I did a project with IDEO last summer where we were looking at the future of gestural controls. So we hired a conductor, an orchestra conductor, and a mime, and a magician, and we're using 3D cameras to try to figure out how could you just gesture to stuff around you? Because that's really what you want to do. I mean, I love Chuck, and I think voice is taking over, but it's totally awkward for most things around the house. Like, you don't want to have to open an app to control your lights and music. You don't want to have to talk to it, like, especially when it doesn't work, your kids make fun of you. And instead, you just want to, like, point to a thing and then do a little gesture. Or point to it with one hand and then gesture with the other hand.
I think
or just do like a gesture against your face. And that's the subtlety that we want out of IoT control, I think.
I think what you're pointing at, what you're gesturing towards, David, is actually really important, that there's a multimodalism that's important. Even as in a gesture alone, you're doing multiple gestures. You have to be looking at the entire movement, not just a single point of information. And it's the same way if I go like, look at that. I'm actually using 3 different modalities here. I'm using my own eyes to gesture, to invoke. I'm using my finger, and I'm using my voice all at once. And so we have to be able, if we're moving towards this natural interaction modality, we have to be looking at different modalities all at the same time. Just in the same way that a good smartphone actually incorporates many modalities into its interaction model. The world around us needs that as well.
Put that there. That was a famous famous demo.
And David, in your book, Enchanted Objects, you've also argued that the cell phone monopolizes attention and that there's an opportunity to unglue society from these screens by spreading apps into everyday objects. When is this happening? I want it to happen.
I mean, the notion that apps leap off of the phone and into everyday things, I think it's a nice metaphor for looking at the things that we attend to, like our music apps or our mapping apps, and just thinking about what would be a better interface or an alternative interface to mapping or to music or to all the things that we use every day. And I think journalists love to say, this will cannibalize this. You know, like there'll be no longer phones once we have AR glasses. But obviously, like, we're living in a world of multiples, and so I think we'll just have more and more interfaces. But I often get my students to think about apps and think about furniture, and then try to map like apps into furniture. Like to say, like, this is a coffee table, like, coffee table, what would you like, what app would you like to house? And the coffee table might say, I'm not like ordinary tables, I'm low, and I'm about informality, so therefore I might be good for just paying attention to the conversation and showing pictures of places that are mentioned, or I might be good at just showing a map if you mention a place, or, you see what I mean? So I think the nice thing about thinking about furniture as a destination for apps is because it's the stuff that we come in contact with and that we interact with the most every day, like door handles and lighting and clothing. And that's the places that I think are most pregnant for being more convenient interfaces.
For like a UI disruption in materials. Let's talk a bit more about mobile and how that impacted life. I believe the first mobile disruption came for the wealthiest of the world, but the next waves will come for the rest of the world, where there's serious gaps of infrastructure, lack of access to electricity, access to health, access to financial services. And James, I know you worked with some NGOs like Doctors Without Borders. How was your experience like, and how has mobile affected the most in those places?
I think the first thing to do is to put aside the assumptions that those different emerging markets or third world nations are not mobile literate. And in fact, I think what you're seeing is in fact a divergence in the types of literacy and the usage with those spaces. And so we, as if I can broadly speak, let's say as a native North American at least, to make sure I'm solidly over in another continent when I describe this, we're used to this legacy of these consumer apps and this consumer space. And in fact, we've had this incremental innovation for a long time and built up our patterns, our expectations of usage. A lot of those mobile devices, particularly starting with the Nokia devices that were distributed throughout Africa, India, and beyond, just disrupted that market. It brought digitalization, connectivity to those markets, and they became shared. What you saw were divergent use cases. There were lots of shared economies, banking, connectivity, and now you start to see a lot of usage in emerging markets, particularly like India, where there's large rural cultures, where they're looking at really precise weather data, predictive forecasts for their crops, and they are really going this full-on connected farming and agriculture society in ways that are outstripping and really beyond what we're doing in majority of farmland in the Western world, which is absolutely remarkable.
And David, you founded Vitally, a connected peel cap, and now you have a mission at Warby Parker to make vision tests more accessible. What's your take on this?
Well, if there are 1 billion people that need eye screening and eye care, I feel like if they have phones, we should take advantage of the technology that's there. I mean, I think for small screens, I do feel like texting services, chatbots, and voice will lead in those kind of markets as well, though, because I think we need to learn how to interact with brands with voice. We don't really know that yet. It'll be companies like Vui who help brands develop the brand voice and the interaction paradigms. As Chuck was talking, he sort of he put in mind this picture of talking about insurance while sitting on your couch at home. And I thought, wow, that's really a provocative idea. Like, would you sit at home and your Alexa's there and you're like, I'm thinking about risk. And maybe the home is the appropriate place to do that, but it feels like a very different posture than usually you think about interacting with insurance. It's like, it's a paper-based thing. Somebody's pushing a folder across the table at you. But it's perfectly appropriate to have a conversation about investments or insurance when you're sitting at home with a wife or partner sitting at a couch. So I think we're going to have to learn new interaction styles as we have more interfaces that are proliferating.
But then this unleashes an immense amount of data in our everyday lives. So aren't you scared of the centralization of control and centralization of data that this IoT devices and us speaking to different furniture at home creates?
Yes. Yeah, sure.
And what should we do about it?
Well,
is blockchain the answer?
It might be. I think healthy competition is the answer, but also in a way, a democratization or an accessibility on the tooling for startups like we have at PODIM or other places. I mean, I would actually challenge something that David said, which was not to compete against Amazon. I think it's important that more organizations, maybe not head on, that's going to be a really uphill battle, but look at other large plays that you can do to keep that field balance. A future where only Amazon and Microsoft and Google control, whatever 90x% of the data, I think is just bound to bring up real problems. But if we have other horizontal platforms that come in and maybe transmorph what you expect, where your data goes, I think that's a very exciting future.
I guess I would just disagree with the trying to be horizontal as a startup. I think it's folly to think that you can compete for cloud services or database or those types of things. I feel like one of the things I'm going to tell Chuck later is that you should really focus on really picking a very particular type of interaction for voice or a particular type of market. Maybe it's fashion, but I think startups just, even though you'd like to say our total available market is this big because we're able to do everything for all people, usually startups succeed when they can be very pointed and very niche-y and go industry vertical specific. I mean, for example, that was what killed my last startup, the computer vision startup, because we were building classifiers to be able to automatically label stuff that would be found in social media photos or video. And then look what happened. Amazon acquired another company and competed. Google gave it away. Microsoft has one. IBM has one. And boom, we, as a horizontal play, we couldn't compete. If we were doing something we were working for TripAdvisor and just labeling which were the best photos to show. And if we had said, we're only doing hotels and hospitality and the use of photos, the best user-generated content for hotels and hospitality, we might still be in business because we would have picked a niche that's too narrow for the big clouds.
Giants
for
to
the
come
big
in.
clouds, yeah.
But are we going towards a data monopoly or away from a data monopoly from a commercial standpoint?
What is a data monopoly?
Companies like Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, they all have a data monopoly on, let's say, social media, for an example.
I would actually, I'd look a little bit further in the future. I'm actually, it's a real pain in the ass right now with GDPR. I actually think regulation plays a role in our future. I think government does play a role in helping to balance this out. I would look at one example company in a different field, which is IKEA. IKEA actually invests around 20-year horizons on sustainability innovation. The reason they're doing that is not necessarily because they're just great Swedish people who care about the world, which they are. And that's terrific. But they are anticipating European regulatory shifts on the environmental controls of production and supply chain. And they're in a position now where they can get further out ahead and essentially say, hey, look, we should, from a pure business decision standpoint, be doing good for the world. And I think at a long enough horizon, corporate interests and human interests actually align pretty well. One of the major issues with something like a data monopoly is the usage of that data. And when you're looking at quarter-by-quarter results, it's very difficult to look at the human longevity as your main area of value.
There's a good question from an anonymous in the audience. Do you imagine a world when tech in life and work becomes so good it's not even noticeable anymore? And I want to bring that question to robots. are they taking our jobs? Is this something good? Should we be glad that they're going to do all the work?
I think the robots taking our jobs is a very good way to sell newspapers. I think robots are taking facets of what we do all day, and they're automating away the worst part of your own job. And like use cases of that are like robotics that have been used in farming. Like you didn't want to pick all that cotton. Robotics that are used in working, the type of work that we do, like finding the right photo, spell checking, pulling together research, finding the right people to fill a position. Like all of that stuff is just like mind-numbing drudgery, and thank God we have automation for that stuff.
And does that make the wealthy more wealthier, or give the poor more time to be creative and learn skills and be actually productive or become intelligent workers?
You're handing that one off to me. Thanks, David. No, I'm not sure I can get in on the socioeconomic aspects of that. I mean, we like participating in and designing those systems. I think again, to riff on my own theme a little bit, this is one of those wicked problems that doesn't have a practice behind it. I think there are all sorts of socioeconomic shifts which we simply don't know the result of, and automation being one of these things. And we actually have to try it, but we have to try it in a way that we can iterate, that we can reflect, that we can run pilots on, that we can simulate. And I think we have to be conscientious of how we do that, and I think a design mentality helps to wade into those areas. I'm not inherently afraid of those spaces. I think there are other elements to sort of this machine robotic automation world, which I have not necessarily concerns about, but for instance, how we identify ourselves with the world at a purely philosophical level. These enchanted objects, for instance, your ontology, how you know the world around you. Your parents, compared to our children, are vastly different in terms of their expectation on the physical world around you. And that's, I think that's not actually looked on closely enough to say, how do I communicate and what is my expectation around the earth and the space around us? It's different. This is the first time in history when my expectation of the world to give back or actually suggest that I do something, that hasn't happened before. I think that's a really big change.
Our time is up, but I'm going to have a last question about education, since both of you are lecturers. How can the governments and the countries democratize education, make it accessible to billions and not just for the lucky couple thousand? Is this happening? Are you seeing it happen in your universities?
I mean, I am seeing that, like, my MIT students are doing Udacity courses on the side, or Khan Academy sources on the side, or listening to a huge abundance of podcasts. People where I'm doing consulting, like at Bose, are like huge consumers of extra education. So all of those things that we wanted education to look like in the future, we wanted it to be more ad hoc, more just in time, have access experts from anywhere. Like that's happening, and I think people are taking advantage of it, and you should too.
And I would definitely point to open communities, even something you'd find on YouTube and other spaces. And in fact, a lot of the US schools, which are typically private, putting their course material up for free on different platforms, is an amazing trend to follow. I would be wary of some of the privatization, but at the same time, these things cost money. What I would be looking for is what are the most efficient platforms for delivering education, not necessarily weighing the cost or what is free, what's efficient and effective.